Here is the assumption underlying every ECDS investment your health plan has made. That when a provider sees a patient or a member, documents the encounter, records the results, and completes the service, that clinical event is captured in a structured measure-ready format that flow through your data pipeline and satisfy an NCQA message specification. For many plans, that assumption breaks down across a meaningful portion of provider network. And the rate at which it breaks down determines your ECDS closure rate before your data pipeline does anything at all. Welcome back. My name is Peter. Let's get into it. So over the last 2 episodes, we've been building a precise picture of where ECDS data quality fails. Episode 7 focused on what happens after data enters the pipeline, the completeness illusion, BPCE complexity, the multiple parallel programs many MA organizations are operating during the ECDS transition. For today, I want to go one step further upstream. I want to go to the provider office, to the point of care, the moment where a clinical event is either documented in a way that becomes measure-ready data or it doesn't. Because for many plans, the largest remaining ECDS quality problems is no longer technology. Plans have invested heavily in interoperability, CCD ingestion, data platforms, measure engines, and reporting infrastructure. But if the clinical event is not captured in a measure-ready format at the point of care, the downstream technology stack has very little to work with. And most plans have not formally mapped where that breakdown is happening. I want to start with something NCQA says directly, because it appears in their own ECDS guidance, and many organizations, many health plans read past it without fully considering the operational implications. NCQA has acknowledged that not all organizations have the level of structured data capture necessary to support ECDS reporting. Now, think about what that means for a second. The organization, which is NCQA in this case, that is defining the reporting framework, is openly acknowledging that the infrastructure required to support that framework does not exist consistently across the industry. And their recommendation is very straightforward. Improve data standardization, increase electronic data exchange, strengthen clinical data sharing, incorporate data sharing expectations into provider relationships. And those are good recommendations, I might say. They are also multi-year initiative because they require provider cooperation, workflow redesign, operational governance, and infrastructure investment. What they are not is a measure year fix. NCQA has also consistently emphasized that strong clinical documentation is the foundational quality reporting success. That is true. But that statement has major implication. It means the foundation of your ECDS performance sits largely inside your provider network. Not your data warehouse, not your interoperability vendor, not your measure engine, your provider network. And providers, as we all know, documents primarily for clinical care, not for HEDIS, not for STARS reporting logic. Let me make this concrete. So a patient, a member completes colonoscopy with a GI specialist. And 6 months later, they see their primary care physician. The physician documents, unquote, patient reports completed colonoscopy, no concerns, close quotes. The notes exist because the provider documented it. The care happened, right? But in many organizations, in many health plans, that note alone would not reliably generate measure compliance evidence because there is no structured procedure entry, discrete service date, or coded element available to the reporting logic. Some organizations may use NLP, and some may use abstraction workflows, but many do not. What is the result? The care happened. The documentation is there, it exists, but the gap, that measure, still remains open. Now, compare that with a provider organization operating a mature structured workflow. The provider is prompted to record the completed colonoscopy as a discrete procedure result with an associated date. The information becomes a structured data element. The CCD picks it up and contains the procedure. The measure logic identifies it. What will happen? The gap will close. The same patient, the same member, the same care, different documentation workflows, different reporting outcomes. And, sometimes the difference between an open gap and a closed gap is not whether the care happened. It's whether the workflow produced a measure-ready data. And this extends far beyond colorectal cancer screening. Let's look at blood pressure reading. So a provider records blood pressure inside a narrative note rather than a discrete vital sign field. The clinician sees it. The patient receives an appropriate care. But depending on the workflow, that reading may never reliably become a measure-ready evidence. It's the same care, the same member, different documentation workflow, and different reporting outcome. Here's the operational reality most plans have not formally mapped. Your provider network is not a uniform data environment. Your provider network is not a uniform provider environment because some providers generate structured, measure-ready clinical data consistently. Other providers generate clinically meaningful documentation that still requires additional processing before it even becomes measure-ready. So most plans segment providers by performance. Very few segment providers by documentation maturity or documentation quality. But documentation maturity may become one of the strongest predictors of ECDS performance in the years ahead. A provider can be clinically excellent and still generate poor ECDS performance if their documentation workflow is not producing measure-ready data. I hope it makes sense. That distinction matters. Now, I have seen repeatedly two plans, similar measures, similar member populations. One network is dominated by large integrated delivery systems with mature workflow and strong data sharing participation. The other relies heavily on independent practices, specialists, rural providers, and organizations with varying levels of workflow maturity. The same clinical events occur in both populations. The resulting ECDS performance looks very different. And importantly, that is not simply an EHR vendor issue. It is also not a CCD or a data aggregator issue. It is a workflow maturity issue. Two organizations can use the same EMR or EHR platform and produce dramatically different ECDS outcomes depending on the workflow design, the structured data capture practices, the training, the governance, and also the operational discipline. Understanding the provider workflow problem changes three things. First, it changes how you interpret ECDS closure rate. So when ECDS performance trail hybrid performance, many health plans immediately assume it's a technology problem. And sometimes that may be true. But sometimes the provider documented it in a way that was clinically meaningful but not reliably measure-ready. Second is it changes provider engagement. Traditional gap closure outreach focuses on patient lists, open gap list. The question now becomes, where does structured capture breaks down? What information is being documented but not becoming measure ready? Those are workflow discussions and not outreach discussions. The third is it changes how targeted chart retrieval is used. For providers generating clinically meaningful but operationally incomplete documentation, chart retrieval becomes a strategic supplementation mechanism, not because the ECDS failed. It is because the provider workflow maturity varies. And that reality will not change within a single reporting cycle. Now, let me give you something practical. Take your prior year ECDS performance and segment closure rate by provider characteristics, which is integrated systems in independent practices, specialists, PCPs, HIE participants, non-HIE participants, large practices, small practices. Do not start by segmenting by measure. Start by segmenting by provider type. If meaningful variation exists, and it probably does, you have identified where documentation maturity differs across your provider network. That analysis will tell you a couple of things. It will tell you where the provider workflow engagement matters. It will tell you where targeted retrieval creates value. It will tell you where supplementation is likely necessary. And it will also tell you where the ECDS performance is becoming constrained even before it reaches your data pipeline. Your ECDS data is not just a reporting output. It is a diagnostic tool, and you need to use it that way. Here is where I want to leave you. Your ECDS data quality begins at the point of care, not in your data warehouse, not in your CCD processing layer, not in your measure engine. It is at the moment a clinician, a physician, a provider documents an encounter. The organizations performing well under ECDS have done something many others haven't. They know where providers consistently generate measure-ready data. They also know which providers generate clinically meaningful documentation, but still require supplementation, retrieval, chart retrieval, or workflow support before it even becomes measure-ready. They have also mapped documentation maturity across the provider network. They have aligned provider engagement, chart retrieval, supplementation, and data strategy around that map. On the flip side, the organizations that haven't done that are often investing in downstream technology to solve an upstream workflow problem. This is where Podero helps. Through CCD processing that identifies where documentation is clinically present but operationally incomplete for reporting. Through provider network segmentation that highlights documentation maturity. Through targeted chart retrieval for high opportunity provider segments. And also through abstraction quality controls that operate across both digital and retrieved data. So if you want to understand what documentation maturity actually looks across your provider network, that is one of the first things a Podero pilot will establish. The link is in the show notes. I'll see you in episode 9. Have a good one.